So today we're going to talk about integrated border enforcement teams. It's a model we have in Canada for cross-border investigations. Let me just quickly show you what we're going to do, how the afternoon's going to proceed. So I'm going to introduce our guest speaker, who's Sean O'Brien, my former boss. Sean's going to give a presentation. Any questions you have for him after the presentation, he's been willing to accept questions, which is very nice. And then we'll have an activity if you have time. If you don't have time, we won't go on to the activity. It's not an issue here or there. So you can read this on your own. I'll just kind of summarize what I know about Sean, and he can clean up my mess afterwards. Sean's a graduate from the Royal Military College of Canada. He went on to do you're an MP, right, Sean?
Oh, is it?
Military police in the military. Then he joined the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is our federal police service in Canada. You've got 31 now, Sean. Am I correct? Or
30, yeah, just about 32. Yep.
So 32 years of service with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. He's done everything. He's done everything from frontline policing to national security, organized crime, border integrity. He spent some time in the Ukraine as a senior advisor on organized crime. That stint ended because of the war, I believe. Sean, were you not in Jamaica also?
Yeah, I delivered some organized crime courses in Jamaica as well.
Okay, perfect. We have someone who's with Jamaican Customs as part of our one of the students, one of the candidates in the program here. Most recently, he was the inspector in charge of border integrity operations for the province of Ontario. And Sean, what have I missed?
That's good enough, I'd say, Todd. No
issues.
All right, so we'll start here again. My name's Sean O'Brien, and it's really thanks to Todd for allowing me to come in and speak to you here today. I really appreciate the opportunity. Let's switch to the first slide here. So, and there's going to be a couple click-throughs here, but what we're going to discuss here a little bit is just about how changing the face of border integrity is. So you can, presenter, you could click through. There's a couple of animations there, I think, that are annoying. So you click through those. Just some common events here that's happened recently that's really changed the way that we conduct investigations, both with our partners and internationally. So on the top left corner here, you can see you're probably aware of the more recent happening in Poland at the border, where an EU border guard was killed by a spear. In the bottom left corner, that's of course the stamp from Ukraine with regards to Snake Island, where that first initial response during the war in south near Odessa was by the Border Patrol. And then the top right corner is something that happened in 2017 with us here in Canada that drastically changed both how the government looked at border integrity investigations, and also our response to what I would say is probably a bit of a lagging investment in border integrity. And it was a tweet by Justin Trudeau that caused a mass illegal immigration purge into predominantly in the Roxham, Quebec. And the bottom is produced just this week, if you can imagine being part of a border investigation unit and given this. So this is in Ukraine. It's a new initiative by the border police there. And Pomsya means revenge in Ukrainian. And basically what this is it's an advertisement looking if someone has either expertise or as a hobby as a UAV operator. Their border patrol has been giving the opportunity to use UAVs to assist both their investigations, but now with deadly authority as well. So they can imagine being a border patrol investigator, and your part-time duty is to be involved in security by with an offensive capability with drones. Next slide, please. So what we're going to talk about today is just some of the strategic initiatives, the groundwork in Canadian law. It's not kind of dry, but it kind of paints a picture of how we got where we are. And the three main topics we're going to talk about here are going to be partnerships, information sharing, and corruption being the three main, I should say, sticking points with all integrated teams. These are the three, parts where we always seem to come back to the drawing board time and time again. And we'll get into that a bit. Just 1 second, I gotta switch slides here myself. All right, can you switch slides, please? So with the strategic initiatives, you can see the time frame there. One thing that's important is Canada and the U.S. have the longest undefended border in the country, and it's been relatively good at the trade aspect, especially once they ironed out free trade agreement and whatnot. However, actually policing on both sides of the border in a collaborative manner has been difficult. In 1997, they started this Canada United States Border Crime Forum. It was a good first start. They started looking at the possibility of us working on both sides of the border. That was disbanded a few years after that, unfortunately. Anyways, in 2001 was important. Of course, September 11th happened, and that brought about the Smart Border Agreement. That was the first time that they started looking at how do we secure the border from potential terrorist threats, and also organized crime groups. So later on that year, they brought about the Integrated Border Enforcement Team Charter and Info Sharing Agreement. What's really, really important about that is that it had the capacity to share information immediately with people on the other side of the border, instead of having to go through some of these long, protracted, very, very formal processes, to share information. That information that still exists today, and that info sharing agreement later became the backbone of what we get into integrated cross-border maritime law enforcement. So following on from that, you can see that there was a shipwriter, and what shipwriter is based on. It's based on the Caribbean experience with the U.S. and different partners down there, Jamaica being one, Mexico being others, and some of the other islands, where they would, in order to get around issues of sovereignty, they would invite the local police authority to come on American ships and help either the DEA or the U.S. Navy or Coast Guard to conduct drug operations. That same concept was brought up to Canada and the U.S. in order to look at doing a co-crewed boat patrol, using vessels as a framework to have it both Canadian and U.S. authorities with matching reciprocal powers on the same platform. So that came about in 2009 was the first time that they introduced that framework, and that framework grew or used the basic tenets of the IBET Charter sharing agreement for their information sharing. Further on from that, what really became out of that is a couple of years after that was the beyond the border for shared perimeter security. That became the basis of what later became how we as police in Canada got our marching orders as to how our border integrity was going to. What's unfortunate is that also had what they call next generation concept, and which had looked at pushing beyond the border to have not just the maritime approach, but also have officers in each other's cars on either sides of the border. Also had things with regards to technology, having interlinked radio systems. And unfortunately, none of that has happened since then. So you'll see throughout this presentation here how sometimes the strategic direction doesn't hit the road. Things just die in conception, never get off the table. And last, in 2012, the ICMEO Act was signed by both Canada and the U.S., and that what gave us the power to operate on both sides of the border at the same time. There's only one. This is the only example where this happens in Canada and the U.S. Just 1 second. So as you look at that time frame, there's a couple of things that happen in there, and I alluded it to in the first thing. First, September 11th, the terror attack. In 2010, the Vancouver Olympics were also followed on by mass migration, illegal migration for the form of ships. The SV Sunzi out in Vancouver. Of course, 2013, we had high-risk travelers and Al Qaeda in the Iraq War come on board. So again, all the attention got taken off of the border at that time, as far as migration was concerned. And then in 2017, we had Roxham Road. So some of these events coincide with these strategic initiatives. If you click the next click, please, because we'll show the beyond the border. So that's the ultimate outcomes. So you can see there from a customs perspective, and there was the first two had to do with cargo and trade. The third one had to do with integrated investigations. The last one had to do with threats and emergencies. And what's interesting about that is not only did it talk about um, both equipment and critical infrastructure, but this also came into play when COVID happened as well. Next slide, please. So as a result, this how police implemented the pillars for our border integrity was 4 different pillars. So we had enforcement, was generally patrol. We had investigation, of course, intelligence, and finally was partnerships and networking, like public networking. So I'm going to get into this a little bit, the 4 pillars and how we approached to implement what the strategic direction was. Just 1 second. So from a patrol perspective, it's fairly easy in Canada. Like we have a long undefended border, it has both maritime and land aspects. What's come into that now more recently is the air domain. So there's been a much more focus on private airports that, for example, you have the Super Bowl goes ahead in the US, all of a sudden 2,000 planes are aloft at the end of the game and they're going all over Canada and the US, often without customs clearance, whatnot. So that's taken a far more advanced role now in our enforcement presence. But the majority of that is done a day-to-day as far as uniformed police, both in vessels and unmarked and marked vessels along the border. The investigations tend to also for uniform responses is attending to the ports of entry or the airports, especially the international airports. With investigations, primary focuses are on drug, human trafficking, human smuggling, firearms trafficking, and counterproliferation. More recently, there's been some with regards to auto theft with the new issues that have popped up, but those are the predominantly the main issues that we look at from proactive investigations. And partnerships, as we speak, is one of the cornerstones we talk about. So I'll speak that a little bit more in depth after. Next slide, please. So the key challenges what we run into is getting from an intelligence stage in an international investigation to evidence. When I was a young constable, a senior Mountie explained he's from Newfoundland, a small place in Eastern Canada. He explained that an investigation was trying to get the turnip to market, and I thought he was crazy. I had no idea what he was talking about at the time as a young police officer. But as I got more and more experience, I finally understood what he meant. Is that like we as police need to get a product before the courts and they're going to be scrutinized heavily. And that product needs to be not without mistake, but it has to be able to be suitable for that. And there's so many things that can happen during the course of an investigation, particularly international investigations, that can cause investigations to fail before the court stage or fail at court for different instances. So some of the issues we have with that is when we look at the partnerships that we have to consider the entire landscape of what those partners needs are, like how are they involved in, like what their mandates are, what issues they have, because this comes up over and over again. So the most important part of these international investigative teams is building and maintaining those partnerships. And sometimes they're formal in a sense of there's MOUs, and sometimes it's a cup of coffee, talking to someone on the phone on a daily basis. It's that commitment to being a good partner doing things that may not be in your mandate sometimes as an assistance to other units, knowing that you're building trust. Something that's very significant with regards to this is also the second point, consistency. And this is something that in my career, I know we've struggled with as far as the RCMP in particular is concerned. Consistency in so much that the RCMP has changed our mandate so many times, and there's been issues pop up. For example, when Nathan Cirillo was killed on Parliament Hill, all of a sudden, everyone that was available was now doing investigations for national security in Ottawa. And Todd and I were deployed there together, actually. And that completely stopped some ongoing border integrity investigations we were going. The crux of that is that we were engaged with other partners. And by the time we finished that, all those other partners had moved on. The RCMP has done that a number of times where our focus has changed depending on what is new. When Roxham Road happened, everyone was deployed to Quebec to deal with the issues. All the investigations and partnerships that we had before moved on to new partnerships. So that consistency is hugely important. And where it comes up in the partnerships as well is when we're dealing with someone that has either a single mandate sometimes, or if they have a multi-pronged mandate. We'll get into that in a second. The last point there is frank and mutual understanding of constraints and restraints. Sometimes these constraints are, form pitfalls, and other times they form benefits to us. A good example of this is that in doing investigations, sometimes with, say, for example, Britain does not have, the UK does not have the ability to introduce wiretap interceptions as evidence. And if they ask a partner to conduct a wiretap on their behalf, it becomes inadmissible for them. However, if the RCMP or other partner is engaged in a wiretap or takes on a wiretap using some of their information, they can use that information in their own as evidence, whereas they couldn't with their own. So knowing that what your partner has, that constraint that he deals with regards, or she deals with the legal process, is an important thing to get out. I know in RCMP, in my time, I don't know how many times I've had to explain the fact that the RCMP has a disclosure aspect that we must disclose any relevant information. Ergo, it's also resulted in the disclosing of very sensitive investigative techniques, and it's killed investigations because it's been able to reveal informants and whatnot. So that's something that we always make sure that we tell our partners in advance. Hey, sometimes you may not want to tell us certain things, or here are the circumstances where we want to learn something. So next slide, please. So just make sure we're on the same one here. I'm not going to go through each one of these. I'm putting this up so you can see just all the partners that we deal with on a normal basis to implement our mandate. And in that, there's a few important things to know. So if you look at some of these, you can think to yourself as, how many of these investigations, how many of these partners have different mandates and competencies, and what is the benefit for some of those? Some of these organizations with single mandates versus those with multiple mandates. For example, the RCMP has multiple mandates, and we do a lot of the different things that the US side does in one organization. So for us, that means that if you're dealing with someone with multiple mandates, information sharing is far easier. Gaining resources is far easier in order to generate resource management. Also, the ability to coordinate across multiple business lines is easier. However, it often means that sometimes we have a long-term lack of focus. We have diminished expertise sometimes because our people sometimes move around, although we do have significant experts as well. It also involves a bit of puts in a bit of competition, especially where there's different organizations involved or different competing interests. If you're single mandate, for example, when we deal with our partners with the Canada Border Services, they are like really really adept at knowing the ins and outs of both customs and immigration laws. And what's really important to know is that they have additional powers available to them so long as we as police don't get involved and or involve them in more of an agent capacity. Like I said with Britain, if we don't ask them to do something, then we can't be held responsible that they follow their mandate. A good example of this is that a trucker comes to a port of entry and the CBSA can search that truck from bumper to bumper. They can search the individual's phone. They can do all those things without warrant. As soon as we get involved, of course, now there's when there's a criminal investigation starts, then there's a expectation of privacy, and we have to get all the judicial authorizations required. So knowing what your partners can and can't do in their own mandates is a key aspect of international investigations. Next slide, please. So I'll get into, here's one partnership that I'd like to present to you that has worked extremely well for the patrol aspect of one of our pillars. So Shiprider, it's actually known as the acronym there, ICMLEO, but I'll call it Shiprider for short. So the basic history of it is in 2005, it first came about, and it was done almost on a handshake where the RCMP and the Coast Guard and Canada, or the Customs Border Patrol got together and they said, hey, let's do this on a handshake right now. We'll discuss some rules and we'll make it up as we go along. And they did a brief pilot there in the Windsor area. It worked out fine. There was no issues, but they recognized that they needed to formalize this partnership. So they did in 2009, they did the pilot, and this is with the ICMLEO Act framework were already in place in advance of operations. It's the first time I've ever seen in Canadian history where legislation was developed before police actually deploying, based on a request, as opposed to the other way around, where legislation takes time to catch up. So, as I said before, the info sharing is based largely on the Integrated Border Enforcement Information Sharing Agreement. And since then, in 2012, we started some full teams, both in Ontario and British Columbia. And actually, Todd and I started the first team in Ontario together. And they also do part-time operations in Quebec and in New Brunswick in areas that are not under dispute. There are a couple of areas where water is still in dispute between Canada and the US, believe it or not. The other thing that's come up about this is that they came up with a lot of support aspects for this. One was the Marine Security Operations Center in Ontario, which is led by the RCMP. The others, both out in the east and out in the west, are led by the Canadian Forces, and it's predominantly for marine domain awareness. They also set up a Marine Security Enforcement team with the Canadian Coast Guard. And they also put in a border technology piece that looked at doing gap analysis in order to assess the gaps on the border and looked at how technology could improve that response using technology. Unfortunately, as I said before, the MSOC, the GL Great Lakes MSOC, isn't used. I guess it's to its capacity, and part of the reason is some of the partnership issues that they have inside there. They have it's manned by most of the partners on the previous screen. However, they all have different information sharing issues, so it ends up being fairly ineffective because they can't just walk across the floor and share information quickly. Likewise, the Marine Security Enforcement team was disbanded with Canadian Coast Guard. They found there wasn't enough bang for the buck. It was too expensive and it wasn't effective. The border technology piece still has not come into place. In 2015, they looked at hooking radios together. I know that can be done on a very difficult one-off situation that takes probably 2 to 3 minutes in order to hook up a radio to the US through patching different radio sections together. but that still isn't an issue. And this is an example of some of the lack of follow-up from some of the strategic principles that have put down. Next slide, please. Initially, one of the issues that the RCMP and U.S. authorities at the time, it was HSI, wanted to look at was working both sides of the border on. At the time, it was marijuana investigations in Washington, BC, or Washington and the British Columbia area. They wanted to work together cross border. They were having helicopters fly back and forth, people going on foot, whatnot, and they were having difficulty sharing information in a timely fashion. So they did a pilot in 1996 that started this integrated border enforcement team. It had excellent options as far as information sharing. In theory, it was very well planned and drawn up. However, for a lot of different reasons, it just wasn't effective in a sense of it was never resourced well by the RCMP. It was often, sections of 3 and 4 people, trying to conduct high-level investigations without any support from surveillance or access to other resources. And they were financed well, but not staffed well. So if you compare that to a European example where, like, for example, EU Frontex, who now has, a single organization that deals with all the border guard issues and Coast Guard from, across the board, a single system to share information. The Canadian experience with IBET was very much patchwork across the country. And a lot of that also has to do with different chains of command within the provinces. So it's led to an inconsistent application. And as I said before, the inconsistency was difficult on the partner. So right now, the partnership still exists on paper. It's primarily higher level meetings in central and eastern central Canada and eastern Canada. Out west, there are still some sections that maintain the IBET name. However, it's a name only for the most part. In Ontario, in particular, a lot of the partnerships have moved to another competing concept. It was called BEST. BEST and the IBET for a long time were, almost the exact same mandate, and they were competing against the same files. But IBET was understaffed, and BEST was getting results. So obviously, one out. So that ended up being disbanded in 2014, and it wasn't until the mass illegal migration in Quebec after that tweet that I showed with regards to that spurred people to come that ended up causing some reinvestment in border in Canada. Next slide. So Borders Enforcement Security Task Force started in 2005 down on the U.S. border, Laredo, Texas, and it was Homeland Security, and it partnered with CBP. I forgot to mention earlier, actually, on CBP, Customs Border Protection is also still a signatory of the Shipwrighter Protocol. However, they opted out of that because they didn't allow what do they call it, immunity, qualified immunity in Canada. So CBP had to protect their employees. They didn't want to join in on that. That being said, there has not been a single issue as far as use of force or complaints in Shipwrighter to date that have resulted in any concerns. So back to Border Enforcement Security Task Force. In 2006, as I said, ICE took carriage of it, and it's spread over all of the U.S. And there are a couple locations that border on Ontario, namely Messina, Buffalo, Detroit, and then another one up near Sault Ste. Marie. And then, of course, there's a couple in Vancouver area as well. So the difference between IBET concept and this concept is IBET was that teams were supposed to come together and work each other on their own side of the border and come together and share information. BEST took a different approach. They found that IBET wasn't working, there wasn't the commitment. So they took it in their own hands, and they have it so that their partners work under ICE's roof. So ICE has complete control of it, and it's managed by almost a memorandum of understanding where they deem they provide their different partners with Title 19. Title 19 allows them to carry firearms and allows them to enforce the law in the U.S. under that title. Anyways, so it's completely held within under their own roof, allows them to control it and allows them to resource it appropriately. Next slide. So on the right hand side, you can look through there and see some of the issues and some of the successes that BEST has. I'm just going to switch back to my notes here. So what's come out of BEST is that the RCMP's currently, I would say, only involved in a sense of a partnership side. They're not a full contributor to it. They attend meetings with them. They provide assistance when required. However, they've been trying for the last while to try and join this effort. The issue is that, as I said with the with BEST, the two pillars on the right hand side, you can see they cross designate their members, so it allows them to carry firearms and whatnot. So right now there are OPP and Ontario Provincial Police, Peel Regional Police, Niagara, Toronto, and CBSA, are Customs Border Security, that are in being able to work in Buffalo on a daily basis, driving their police cars. It allows for continuous surveillance across, allows for really short term or short notice undercover operations, allows for controlled deliveries and information sharing on a daily basis, day in, day out. As I said, it allows their designated officers to carry firearms and have arrest powers in the US. CBSA is only involved in an intelligence basis. And out in British Columbia, the RCMP has one person deployed to the Bellingham office, but it's in an unarmed capacity. The issue here, again, it comes down to partnerships, is that the Justice Canada has ruled at least in Ontario, that the RCMP has, there's too many sovereignty issues and officer safety and organizational risks here to allow our Canadian officers to go down and conduct surveillance and execute search warrants on residences and arrest Americans on American soil, while being employed by Canadian. However, it's had so far. I've been involved in a number of the investigations for providing support, and it's been incredibly effective. It's achieved the results I think that IBET wanted to have, but it's taken a bit of a different approach. Next slide, please. So, and you can click through on this one as well. So information sharing is probably the second biggest issue that we deal with as far as integrated teams. Some of the main ones are, a lot of people don't know what authorities are there and allow the information sharing. They don't know what limitations are required, and there's no aspect in how to risk manage that information sharing. As you said earlier, before I said, like, one of the issues that we have, bottom left-hand corner, I allude to, we revealed secretive telephone surveillance technology for the first time. And it's not just that. If you were to go on the internet and look up disclosure issues in Canada, you'll see there's a guy by the name of Dave Colby, who's in charge of our technical intrusion squad in Ottawa, who deals with all the really, really sensitive investigations. And he's had to give open testimony in front of our Congress, in front of our Parliament and senators about the use of really, really sensitive devices and methods. And so that's one of the issues that we as Canadians have to deal with, is the disclosure issues that we constantly face in going to trial. So, and that's the other aspect is that when we're looking at going into an investigation and someone supplies us with information, all the information sharing terms have the same general terms. It has to be for consistent use. The information has to be for consistent use. You cannot, go on a boat in Canadian waters and stop a boat and then somehow that information of a Canadian boater ends up in a U.S. intelligence database, for something completely different. The information you pass on has to be reliable, and you have to correct it if you find out that it's not. And most importantly, third-party rule to further sharing. So if you want to use that information, it's caveated so that you need permission of the originator for that, and that's a really significant hurdle to overcome if you don't get it out of the way right at the um, right at the beginning. So what happens is that we have a dichotomy between the timely use of information that can be acted on now versus information processes like formal MLATs for after fact investigation. So I'll give an example here where this was put into place with partners that I wouldn't have normally expected to have been able to do this, but they did a fantastic job at it. A couple of years ago, a friend of mine was the liaison officer down in Jamaica, and he was working a case out of Toronto. The issue is that Jamaica had a wiretap going, and it was one of the first times they'd used this technique in years and years, and they didn't want to disclose it. They wanted to be able to take off the drugs that were being sent through to the Canadian airport, but they didn't want to disclose the fact that they had a wiretap in Jamaica. Canadians wanted to be able to use that information to get a wiretap on their own. So they needed to, work out that how are they going to release this in the end, the fact that this wiretap was invested and manage it. If they use the formal MLAT process, there's no way that you would be able to request the information on an MLAT, day in, day out when you say, hey, the delivery is happening now at this airport, or, so they end up sharing information via the liaison officers on a day in, day out. And they managed to put in a process by which that information would be shared on, timely fashion, either over the phone immediately and followed up with in writing, so that the affiants, both in Jamaica and in Canada, could use the information. So something else with regards to knowing the authorities, and not necessarily the channels that they get shared at. So some of the main ones that people aren't necessarily aware of, that there's other channels, not just simple bilateral agreements. There's the Palermo Agreement, which is the transnational organized crime, and its 3 protocols, covers off human trafficking, smuggling, firearms. It's what's caused most countries in the world to adopt criminal organization offenses. It also allows for mutual legal assistance treaties and liaison officers to exchange information, and also the formation of joint investigation teams. And that's a concept that's also been brought up by in the EU with Europol. A couple other conventions that are really important for the ability to share information that other countries are signatory to. The Convention Against Corruption, the United Nations Convention Against Financing and Terrorism, and the Vienna Convention, which is the against trafficking in drugs. A few other agreements that allow you to share information quickly. That are also is the Five Eyes Agreement, Interpol and Europol, or inclusion in those organs, and also through the UN Office of Drugs and Crime also allows for information sharing. And again, there's bilateral agreements. A good example of that was the Meridia initiative in Mexico and US, and last the IBET agreement and the ICMEO Act in Canada is another example of a good bilateral agreement to share information. In the end, when we're conducting investigations and we're starting to share information, us as Canadians, sometimes we don't want to know the information. We have to ask ourselves the questions with the limitations. Can we use the information? Like, if you get an information that's really nice to know, but none of it can go into a judicial authorization, it's no good to the investigation. Can you protect the source of the message? And if you include it, will it undermine your case? A good example of this happened about 2 years ago in Cornwall, where the Cornwall Regional Task Force was working with the U.S. Border Patrol, and they started an investigation on a human trafficking case that ended up having drug aspects and firearms. The Canadians started writing. They had received an email from the U.S. Border Patrol saying, "Hey, here's the information," and they said, "Can we use it?" And he said, "Yeah, yeah, no problems," kind of thing. I'll get back to you with more details on it. So he gave him some more details over the phone, but it was never ever included. It was never ever included in the disclosure. So the RCMP starts surveillance, spending thousands and thousands of dollars. Get ready to write a wiretap. Begin making arrests along the way. And when they're getting ready to lay charges, they go back to get the disclosure from this U.S. investigator, and he said, "No, sir, you can't use that information. You will disclose who the source is." So the entire investigation, which was probably about 8 months at the time, came crashing down. They couldn't proceed. So it's a good example of if you can't use the information, sometimes it's better not to know it. Next slide, please. See what we're here. Last, so issues bringing with intelligence to evidence is forms of corruption and integrity compromise that you can click. There's a couple more clicks there if you want to click through. So there are a couple of issues we deal with as far as, and it's almost impossible not to deal with them in border investigations. Systemic or endemic corruption. When I was in Ukraine, I served there twice, once before COVID happened, and then that was interrupted for a while, and then once again just before the war as an organized crime advisor. One of the things that I looked at is some of the issues that were causing corruption within the police force, and not just police, but customs. And one of the things I'd never witnessed before was some of the environmental crimes that were going on. And one of the things that happened is that there would be a lumber company would want lumber, right? They have an order for IKEA, so they would go to a certain land plot and want to cut it down. They would talk to the wildlife and the environmental guys, and they say, "Oh, this has got spruce budworm, whatever disease. This whole forest needs to be cut down here." So they would get the authority to cut certain areas of the forest down. It would rob Ukraine of its natural resources. There's laws that say that it can't enter the EU unless it's processed wood. So one saw line on a log and it's processed now, and the border agent, customs agent, police, everyone gets a cut of it, and Ukraine does not get the benefit of the customs payments, and that has a run-on effect in a sense of the reason why Ukrainians, have such an issue is that their state income is so low in comparison to what they actually earn, because so much of it is siphoned off through different schemes or ineffective taxation, the loss of the customs duties, both through gas, gravel, any form of wildlife, you name it, it gets pillaged from the country through different schemes. The police officers, the judges, the doctors, as a result, there isn't money in the treasury to pay them the amount that they need because the taxation level is ineffective. Anyways, that type of systemic thing, like when I looked at some of the police officers, that were involved in the system, they had to pay for promotions. If they wanted to get their degree, they would have to pay the professor to, a fee. It was just, pay for all of these different things that, other people, would not think. So that type of systemic or endemic corruption, it's not because people necessarily want to do that. They're not getting anything out of it, but from their salaries, they can't afford to live. So how else do you expect them to, to pay for kids' medicine or put a roof over their head or anything of that? So that's something that we run into frequently in international investigations when we're dealing with, and it's not necessarily just law enforcement dealing with. There's other, victims of systemic corruption as well. Bribery is a huge one we deal with insofar as law enforcement. There's some examples on the thing of recent cases where RCMP, CBSA, border patrol agents have taken, and some of the issues there and dealing come down to like straight supervision in a sense of, sometimes there's awful lot of times where there's red flags that come up, and it's just a lack of supervision from leadership looking after their people that overlook those red flags. Just one second, I need to check my notes here. A couple of another example you'd see of some of this systemic investigation that we deal with, especially here in Ontario. We would deal with the recent gold heist that happened in the at the Toronto International Airport. It had a internal Air Canada employee that was involved. Also, what we have the luggage handlers or ramp rats, as we're called. It forms a closed society where it's expected that there's going to be systemic corruption. Many examples we've had recently as well for bribery also involved, private individuals that have access to secure information. Sometimes it's been a worker at a courthouse. More often it's a member of our Service Ontario or Ministry of Transportation that allows vehicles to be misregistered or provides people with fake identifications using legitimate government identification. So and the last one is misconduct, and I guess that's kind of more what we're talking about when we're dealing with some of the Service Ontario and whatnot. Some of these misconduct issues stem from all sorts of different issues. You can imagine, whether it be substance abuse or even just improper conduct around the office. Sometimes it breeds contempt, and without being the culture of a certain organization can change, and so those types of things we're frequently dealing with. So the mitigation for that is when you're going into these investigations is to be mindful. That this is going to be an obstacle or not going to be, but has a potential to be. So to have an eye out for it, right? Controlling information, using major case management techniques, controlling sensitive information to need to know only, reacting to the red flags. Again, with we spoke about earlier with regards to relationships and partnerships, forming those good relationships with partners, and lastly, keeping focused investigations consistent with your mandate. So those three things, I guess. Next slide. We know that these internal issues are going to be an issue. So it's important to react to them within practice. So Canada's approach to border integrity over there is somewhat of a patchwork approach, but it's seen resurgent in recent years. And there's been a number of efforts attempted and abandoned during that time, like we spoke about IBET and MSET. New ones started as priorities change. As I said in the beginning, some of the strategic direction filters down to assist investigations. However, a lot of it doesn't. And it's again to that the difference between in theory and in practice. I mentioned early on that there was a group, the Cross-Border Crime Forum, that had been disbanded. It had been resurrected in 2021, I believe, underneath Biden and Trudeau administrations, and they published their more recent report. It kind of speaks to what I've been getting at. What I've been getting at here, in a sense that some of the main things that came out of the meeting when they looked at everything that was going on between the Canadian and U.S. border. Some of the main things they mentioned were strengthening the information sharing between the two countries. They looked at exploring the creation of a cross-border task force to deal with the gun smuggling and trafficking. And I found that a little bit odd, in a sense that they didn't look at going back to IBET. They didn't mention BEST as the option. They looked at looking at something entirely different. And probably the thing that struck me the most is that they underscored the need to build on and further operationalize prior memorandums of understanding. So the point being, or where I twigged on that with regards to the further operationalized, is that in theory, all the tools are there, but they're not being used appropriately, and that's what they meant by further operationalizing it. They've done everything they possibly can to grease the skids to allow us to investigate. However, for some reason, that just does not seem to translate into practice on the road, and I'm not exactly sure why. But in their most recent um, meetings, those are the topics that came up, are still issues for us. Anyways, unless you have any questions, that's it for me.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you very much. You highlighted some really important things, resource commitment, understanding mandates, legislative support, corruption, a whole bunch of stuff that are real roadblocks when we think about how do we cooperate across international boundaries. And that's probably the big piece we're talking about, is how do we cooperate across international boundaries. I have a couple of questions, and I'm going to allow the students to, if you're okay with that, to ask you some questions also. Can they type it into the, yeah. So could the students, if you have a question, the candidates type it into the chat, and we'll feed them to you from here. But I'm going to use my mandate as the, what am I? The boss? Sure, to ask the first probably two questions of you. So the first question, you have experience doing investigations, cross-border investigations in Canada, and you also had the experience in the Ukraine. Can you kind of compare these and tell us the difference in the constraints between something like in the Ukraine and something like in Canada? Our students come from around the world, and they've got much different constraints than we do have in Canada. I just kind of wanted to know if you can highlight some of those constraints, how they differ.
So Ukraine was different. I wasn't in an investigative role there. I was trying to help. They have an organization there in the National Police called the Strategic Investigation Unit, and they do all the high level investigations in Ukraine. So I was involved in kind of doing some autopsies on some investigations there. And so I'll speak a bit to that, the difference being, so they don't have a disclosure burden in Ukraine whatsoever. They do not have the same privacy aspect issues that we have. And I'll give you an example of that. I was sitting in who would be the equivalent of the chief of the sections. Yeah, myself, and there was a guy from Estonia and another guy from Lithuania there, and we were talking about, and a judge from Sweden, and we were talking about some of the issues we had to do, human rights, privacy, that sort of thing. And my Estonian colleague passed the chief his card, and the chief went to his phone, and within seconds, he looked up and he passed his phone over, and he could show that, he could list all the calls that he had made since his last billing thing. He could show where the phone had been tracked to, who the billing was, who was paying the bill. And this was an EU phone, like a diplomatic type phone. He pinged it to inside the room. He did it in seconds using an AI bot on Telegram. And it shook me to my core in a sense of how, like, the lack of privacy controls that they, and I thought in the sense of, from a perspective of a police officer, I thought, how easy would that be to be abused? So it was one of those things that made me really think about, if I'm going to share information with these, whoever it is, it highlighted a whole other gamut of fears and possibilities could go wrong. That being said, now that they're in a war footing, the fact that they're able to do that, I think is fantastic as far as, in a national security setting, but in a criminal investigation thing, it's scary. So that's I mentioned before as well that Canada disclosed the fact that the Five Eyes used the IMSI catcher, the what do you call it, the Stingray device. While I was in Ukraine, we had discussed some of these investigative techniques and how they used them. And one thing that was incredibly different from what they do there, for those of you that aren't familiar, an IMSI capture is basically a cellular transportable cell phone tower that provides a stronger signal. So your cell phone will not go to the regular tower; it'll bounce off of this suitcase. It's called a IMSI catcher. Anyways, they use one in Ukraine. However, in Eastern Europe, most of the doors in apartment buildings are outwardsly opened and they're steel, or it's almost impossible to break into them. So I asked how they deal with that. I said, "Oh, we use these Stingray. We pretend that we're the guy's wife or his buddy. We're say, hey, we're down at the front door. Can you let me in?" kind of thing. And so they'll morph their friend's phone using the IMSI catcher, and so again, the shivers went up my spine to think of like the different techniques that they use. Incredibly creative, but as far as sharing information and concerns, for human rights and protection of privacy, that sort of thing, shook me to my shiver, to the bones, kind of.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a second question before I get to the one we got online here. You talked a lot about how things just kind of stop working
Yeah.
for whatever reason. I think you used there's lack of follow up on many strategic initiatives. I want to know why that is. Why do you think that is? And more importantly, how do you get around that? How do you make sure that it doesn't happen?
Okay, I'm going to address that last little bit first. In a sense that, and this is why partnerships is so important, is that I don't care what problem you are forced to deal with over, like if you have a good relation with someone on a one-on-one basis kind of thing. I don't mean like you're having beers or whatever, but if you have a good relationship with someone, you can solve pretty much everything. What I found in police, you'll find some way to get around whatever hurdles that are, if you have built a trusting relationship with the person. And everybody knows that in their own lives. If you were to go ask your best friend, if you had a problem and went to your best friend and said, hey, how do we deal with this? You're going to come up with a solution as best you can. So to be short, you have to, in order to have good partners, you got to be a good partner. So, that means, doing a professional job whenever it's asked of, going above and beyond, being proactive, having the coffees, making the phone calls, sharing information, being the first person to be a good partner. That's how you get around that stuff. How it happens, in my opinion, in my personal, I can't say how it happens elsewhere, but I would say that the RCMP having multiple mandates and multiple chains of command, there's no so that the people understand, there's 10 provinces and 3 territories in the RCMP. Each one of the provinces and each one of the territories has a different commanding officer. It's like having a completely different police force. They don't answer to each other. They don't coordinate with each other necessarily. Not all provinces have a border, so they may not have the same issues. Having those 10 different commanding officers and no direct line to the border integrity program in Ottawa makes so that there's no consistency throughout, and they can use their resources as they see fit, so they can rob from Peter to pay Paul. And what's happened over the years is that every time there's a shiny rock comes up, whether it be mass migration in Quebec or whether it be high risk travelers, or now it's the opioid crisis. So we have limited resources, and we're trying to plug holes, with those limited resources, and we just cannot address provide the coverages that that we need for the mandate. So something falls through the cracks. And unfortunately, if you're like the IBET program, if hey, yeah, we're going to do this, and you and your 3 guys show up, and that's all you got, and oh, we got to go, we got something else, you become an unreliable partner. So I think that's how the IBET thing kind of fell off the rails.
Okay. Eric is with CBSA. He part of the maritime domain out there, I guess, best I can put it. He asks, building partnerships and collaboration can be difficult when parties involved are apprehensive to work outside pre-established legislation, regulations, etc. How do you overcome that apprehension to progress partnerships?
All right, so I'll give you a CBSA example, actually. So one example is CBSA has taken part in in the best right now. The RCMP is not. Their leadership is willing to go out and say, hey, yeah, we're going to give this a try. Kind of. For some reason, powers that be on the RCMP side are not. I don't know why, and it's like trying to push an iceberg to try and to get them to move. That being said, there's a lot of areas where we collaborate on very well. For example, the RCMP and the CBSA have an MOU which requires the RCMP to show up and deal with drug seizures. We were having a really significant issue with this in one area in Ontario, and we were having phenomenal success of getting charges on these large drug loads and doing what we basically do autopsies on a load that arrives, say in Windsor. We would be able to track back using partnerships with HSI and DEA and prove to guilty pleas or found guilty that this was an organized crime load and get people at either end by using various investigative techniques. Very, very successful in area A, say for example. In area B, the CBSA who report to different regional directors, we would have zero cooperation with CBSA. So, and what I mean by that is that we would show up and CBSA would have torn through the entire load, destroyed evidence, like only doing their thing without even stopping and saying, "Hey, we know we have a big load now. Let's call the RCMP and let's think about evidentiary because we're going to turn this over." They have a mandate; they're required to turn it over. So they wouldn't phone. So things would happen like there would be a set of wire cutters, in something, and there would be evidence that a load had been cut through, but they didn't seize the wire cutters. You could prove that was handled. There's DNA. There's different things would happen where certain things would be taken out of here. There was no record of where it was found. There's 3 phones. Which one did the guy have? Like all these evidentiary issues, and for the life of us, we could not get this CBSA region to just pick up the phone. Hey, you've got a big issue. You got a big load. Give us a call. We'll get in our cars. We'll come out. We'll help. We'll do it together. And meanwhile, we're having loads and loads of success at the neighboring unit. So how do we handle it? Got in the car, drove out there, got a hotel night, went down the next seizure we had kind of thing. I went a couple times there. Hey, this is what we're looking. We're not trying to do anything. Here's the program. This is how we're going to do it. Here's a couple of examples of success. This is what we want to do from you guys. You've got our word that we're not, and I found out when we got there, yeah, but you know what? 2 of your guys came in here. They were dicks. They were jerks. They tried to throw themselves around kind of thing like this. And so we ate a bit of humble pie. I said, you know what? I apologize. I'll talk to the guys kind of thing. I'm sure they're just sick and tired of coming here and having problems kind of thing, but there's no excuse for them to be jerks. And next thing you know, the partnership starts. Okay, we'll give it a try. So you have some support from the bosses. Next thing you know, you have a big success. The guys on the street all want to work well, but they weren't getting the support from the bosses. So you end up, putting in some shoe leather, burning some gas, paying a few restaurant bills, and things get patched up.
Okay, we got a question from Trudy, and Trudy's with Jamaican Customs. And she wants to know, based on your experience working in Canada and conducting training in Jamaica, what recommendations would you give the Jamaican authorities to combat OC?
That's a tough one. I was amazed at the difference between organized crime in Jamaica and then it is in North America. So that's a great thing. I think the main thing that I would say to Jamaica is Jamaica has it's been a couple of years that I've been there. But they've got a unit that's been supported by the US that's there, and Canada uses them as well. They're handpicked and selected. They've been having an awful lot of success. I'm trying to remember the name of it off the top of my head, but they've all been, polygraph trained, you name it, and supported by other organizations. So they were having a lot of success. And I find that, as they say, success has many fathers and it breeds success. So the first thing I would do is look at who is doing a good job there, and then, pick up the phone, give them a call, and start making those partnerships with them to look at joining efforts and with those people that are having success. As far as addressing organized crime, From a systemic level, I'm not sure exactly what all the problems are in Jamaica. When I was there was an awful lot of murder for hire that was happening. There a tremendous amount of gang violence as well. Um,
Mhm.
that has that's I guess too long to get into as far as that. Anyways, to answer your question quickly, I know that there's a couple of units in Jamaica that are doing a fantastic job, and I would be ringing their bell.
Last question, Sean. It's from Hasantha, who's, correct me if I'm wrong, Sri Lankan customs, right? Okay, thank you.
Okay.
It's interesting. It's interesting to see that corruption is still one of the key challenges that you face when it comes to investigations. What sorts of anti-corruption measures are in place in Canada to minimize or mitigate its effect?
There's a so Canada uses a technique when we conduct investigations called major case management, and it involves a team. It's headed by three people. So you have a team commander, a primary investigator, and you have a file coordinator. Those three people handle like the speed flow and direction of the file. So if they're going to, go a certain direction, it's the team commander that issues the order. Hey, this is where we need to go. He's going to get all the resources. The primary investigator is going to make that plan happen, and the file coordinator is going to be the keeper of the record. They're going to make sure that everybody's notes and everything that needs to be in the file to be disclosed is there. That process causes a paper effect or an investigative effect, an accountability framework. Hey, we need your notes. Your notes aren't in this week. I need your notes. So you can look, oh, what are we doing? Like, what's, how come, that sort of thing. So it ends up being a tracking mechanism. The other thing that happens is that if you're not part of the team, you're not involved. So you limit access to the file. You limit access to wiretap room. There's no talk, with briefings in advance with regards to your investigative team. You team build with your team. You discuss these things. You talk about integrity compromise. You talk about ethics. You talk about what the expectations are of your team, and you build that team so that and if anyone new comes in, they get the same. They get the same thing. We don't talk about this. We don't talk about it at coffee. So it's an internal control that way. Otherwise, I mean, there are other external um, triggers, I would say, with respect to we have with our information sharing and Canadian police information, we list certain things on there. For example, if certain individuals are queried, we put our undercover cars on there. We put, people that we're looking at, so that if someone all of a sudden starts querying using police databases to check something that they're not supposed to, we'll get hits on that. So those are the two main ones I can think of right now, is having a really, really um, tight investigative team so that the information's on need to know. And you have those, we call them business rules, but you have those accountability frameworks in place through a major case management system. And you have three sets of eyes looking at everything. So
Could you
what ends
take
up
a minute?
happening is,
Sorry. I was going to ask you, and just take a minute and explain McNeil as part of one of those. It's one of those controls, I think, also.
Yeah. So
McNeil.
Yeah, the McNeil decision had to do with disclosure of a police officer's record. Um, so if a police officer was disciplined, under the Police Act or something like that, if it had to do with his or her anything to do, well, if there was any sort of discipline, it would just get disclosed to the Crown, to the lawyer in charge, and then the Crown would decide if it was relevant or not to the defense. So if, say, for example, a police officer got caught in something that's indicative of deceit, fraud or whatever it is, or, lying, something like that, then there'd be a record of that discipline and that would be disclosed to the judge. So that would often, if you have a McNeil report, that often meant that you were no longer welcome or available to work on any files of any significance. So that's another thing that's happened in our jurisdiction there. That's from case law.
Thank you, Sean. We've come to the end, and I really, really appreciate you taking your time. I know you're far away in Europe right now, and it's late for you, and I appreciate that a great deal. This is really insightful. I'm sure that everyone got a lot out of it. So again, thank you very much, and we'll be in touch when you're back.